everyone. Thank you for coming. There's still a few people trickling in, but there's not a lot of time, and I was hoping to save some time at the end for questions, so I'm going to start right away. Yeah, my name is Osama Dorias. This is my cartoon form, which is actually my true form, but it's not my final form. I'm a lead game designer at Warner Brothers Games in Montreal. I'm also a teacher of game design at Dawson College in Montreal. The co-founder of the Montreal Independent Game Awards and the chair of the IGDA's Muslims in Games Special Interest Group. These are some of the other games I've worked in. I've been in the industry for about 12 years now. I said games, but I meant studios. These are some of the games I worked on. So I've actually worked on about 20 different games, mobile, AAA, indie, VR, and in-flight entertainment. I used to say airplane games, but people thought it meant flight simulators. I didn't work on those. I worked on those annoying games that when you're trying to fall asleep in your chair in an airplane and you feel someone poking behind your back, that's my fault. So I was born in Baghdad, Iraq. We left actually the country right before the Iraq-Iran war. We moved to Canada after a few years of jumping from country to country, and we settled in Montreal. I still live there. That was 35 years ago. I moved there when I was 5 years old. And I'm a proud Canadian and Montrealer and Quebecois. I'm very happy to be here though. But this will explain why I'm a little bit jet lagged and why I may not finish some of my sentences. So growing up, I had a little bit of an identity crisis because it made sense. I mean, my parents came from a different place, we had different values. But one thing that was consistent is that I always loved movies, comic books, and video games from a very young age. Also, I have a very deep love for my faith. And to me, this was not in conflict in any way. My heart had room for both. You're probably asking yourself why I have a picture of a burger on the screen. This is a metaphor, but it's actually true at the same time. Growing up, I had a little bit of an identity crisis, especially when it came with certain things that I saw on TV and how I didn't see them in my everyday life. And hamburgers were one of that. So I would see commercials about going to McDonald's and how burgers are delicious, but my parents kept a strict halal, which meant we kept a strict halal. And early days of living in Montreal, there were not a lot of restaurants that served halal meats. And because of that, I didn't have a burger until much later. My parents, of course, loved us and tried to give us whatever we wanted. So when my mother figured this out, she made us homemade burgers. And they were great, I liked them, but they weren't, I just figured that they were not the same, and I wanted the real burgers. And my dad would take us to McDonald's and give us fish burgers, but they didn't make commercials about fish burgers. I wanted the thing that the other kids were eating and smiling. Eventually, I did have a real burger, and was actually more disappointed because my mom's burgers were better, but I put them up on this pedestal. This is a metaphor for a lot of the things that I felt like I was lacking growing up. In the 90s were especially interesting because, as I mentioned, I loved movies, and I used to watch them every chance I got. Some movies, even though I really wanted to like them, unfortunately I couldn't. A few examples of these were the Indiana Jones movies and the Back to the Future, because they vilified Muslims. And in so doing, they misrepresented me. And even if my friends were talking about them in a very positive light, it would just bring out these negative emotions. And it should come as no surprise that I actually love the X-Men. And the reason for this is I saw myself in them. The X-Men were a group that were hated by the world that they wanted to defend and protect. And my Islam growing up was one about being kind to people, about sharing, about giving, not the one that they were portraying in Hollywood. So even though the X-Men, at the time especially, they had no Muslim members and they were not Muslim, they resonated with me, and I loved them more than any other superhero group. And I love video games because, especially early on, the vast majority of video games at least didn't mention Islam. And I would rather you don't mention it. If you're going to misrepresent me, I'd rather you just leave out my faith and my culture from the equation. And of course, this changed eventually with the rise in popularity of first-person shooters. We again started seeing Muslims being vilified even in this medium. And that was heartbreaking. Fast forward to 2007 when I got my first job as a game designer in the industry. I loved it. I couldn't even believe that I was working in one of the entertainment fields, a thing I grew up with and absolutely adored. And I really loved my coworkers. As you might know, though, if you've been in the industry long enough, the language of diversity and inclusion, it didn't exist back then. And so even my coworkers that I loved, who meant well and who actually loved me, sometimes they would say things that were misrepresenting me as well. Today we call them microaggressions. So the best of them were, oh, you're one of the good Muslims. And the worst, something along the lines of calling me a closet terrorist as a joke, and everything in between. And of course, I put on a brave face because that's what you do when you're surrounded with people who won't understand when you tell them what they're doing is hurtful. And eventually it became easier to talk about these. And the people who would even say these things would come later and apologize. I know they meant well. I know that it was never coming from a bad place. It doesn't make it less hurtful. As a designer, to this day, I'm still a generalist. And this comes from the fact that I actually was working on very small teams when I started in the industry. I used to work on mobile games before the iPhone, if you know what that means, the Java flip phone games. Our teams are about between 3 and 5 people. If I was a designer on a team, chances are I was the only designer on the team. So I had to design everything. I was doing the UI, the AI, the level design if we had levels, everything. So the teams grew to a point that we had disciplines within games, especially disciplines within game design, I should say. This is the first game that I actually was able to have my hand at narrative design. My friend, Raina Anderson, was the narrative designer on the project, and then when she went on maternity leave, I took over for her. And she was a great mentor, and it was wonderful. But it was taking over from someone else's work, and I was making sure that whatever beats she wanted were still in the game. Eventually, on Dungeon Hunter 4, I got the chance to be the narrative designer myself and to start with a game. So if you don't know the Dungeon Hunter series, they're kind of like hack and slash games similar to Diablo. So I came up with a lot of stories, and a lot of these are actually sourced from the team. I said, do you have any ideas? Like, we could go in any direction for this. The stories didn't need to follow from one franchise to the next. We had a rare opportunity where if we wanted, we could either continue or start over. And the ideas came in, and a lot of them were really original and interesting, and we boiled them down to a few that we really cared about, and we pitched those. And from them, unfortunately, from our disappointment, the one that our bosses wanted, they just wanted humans fighting demons, because this, for marketing reasons or for whatever, this is what they thought would sell more. So a lot of my team members felt a little sad and defeated, and to be honest, to a certain extent I was as well. But I chose to frame this as an opportunity that within these confines we could still maybe make a meaningful game and tell a meaningful story. So we came up with something. We came with the humans in our world, or human-like creatures, were called the Valen. They come from the specific part of our map called Valentia. And their antagonists were called the Kinashi, these giant ogre-like creatures who actually had no redeeming value. They were just bad. And they were framed as such. And they had a centuries-long war. Of course, a lot of these beats, as I mentioned, came from our bosses. They had centuries-long war where it was kind of a stalemate, but at this point, the ogres, the Kinashi, were starting to win. And the Valen thought all hope was lost. And then suddenly, out of nowhere, demons appeared, and they started killing everyone indiscriminately. So the royals of the Valen blamed this on the Kinashi. They said the Kinashi summoned the Kinashi warlords summoned the demons. But later, as you progress through the game, you realize that, no, that doesn't even make sense. The Valen were losing, so obviously it was the Valen who summoned the demons first. And in the end, it didn't really matter, because demons don't care. Demons are going to kill everybody, and the demons were summoned. So you do uncover the truth that both sides did summon the demon. This forced the Valen and the Kinashi to join forces or face extinction. So at least some good came out of it. So they fought the demon horde and banished them into the void where they came from. If it's not obvious, the Kinashi for me represented the other, the group that we don't know, the ones that are from a faraway land that have habits and cultures that we don't recognize. And because of that, we vilify them, and we pit ourselves against them. But really, the honest truth is, they're very much like us. And in our games, we gave the opportunity for the players to visit Kinashi camps. And this comes later in the story. At the beginning, we actually leaned into it. Later in the story, you visit the camps, and you see that they can actually are just trying to live their lives just like anyone else. Sure, they do things slightly differently and they may even look different, but they're really one of us. And, whoops, I went too far. So this wasn't a secret agenda. I didn't put this into the game without talking to my team. I had the support of all my team. And when I was explaining to them why we were making these beats, they were all for it. Because I was working with decent people who actually wanted to learn and wanted to understand where I was coming from. So I saw this as an opportunity and I leaned into it. And the results were, instead of working on a game that nobody really cared about, that was enforced by our bosses, we actually worked on something that was deeply meaningful to some members of the team, and at least to some level meaningful to every member of our team. So in preparation for this presentation, I actually hit up the Twitters and I asked a lot of game devs if they've ever put something personal into their games. I received over 300 replies, so of course we don't have the time to go over all of them, but I have a whole bunch on the slides, but we're going to go over each one or two per category just so you get an idea of what it is. So a lot of people chose to use games as a vehicle to discover or to explore their identities. And there are many different kinds of identities that we're going to talk about. So for example, racial identity. So Crystal Hazelton is a writer at Avalanche Software. And she wrote a character who was dealing with being biracial. To deal with, basically, to explore her upbringing when her mother was often seen as her caregiver instead of her mother because she had darker skin. We have gender identity issues where Olivia Alexander, a writer at Ubisoft, who wrote a monologue for one of the characters to explore her own inability to speak up in the workplace and how she wanted to address that. Then we have sexual identity with Jacob Burgess, a writer on Baldur's Gate Siege of Dragonspear, who through writing for a character called Glint, he addressed one of the first positive male gay romances in video games. We have political identity with Yifat Sheikh, pronounced Sheikh in Arabic, who made a game called Real Army Simulator to address misconceptions about the time she spent fighting in the Israeli army. There's religious identity with my friend Caitlin Tremblay, a narrative designer at Ubisoft in Toronto, who made a game about a girl who was escaping a cult to deal with her own complicated feelings with faith and religion. And we have the Drake of Blades in the Imperial City in the Elder Scroll games, who is an Aspie, because Rich Lambert, basically one of his sons, was that, and he wanted to pay homage to him. There are a lot of devs also who put their own personal struggles in our games. We have Daniel Cook, who made a game called A Road Not Taken, about his struggle with the decision not to have children. There is Chris Schroyer, who was a producer on The Wolf Among Us, who was dealing with loneliness, and that loneliness actually seeped into Bigby, the main character of the story. There are many different relationship situations that came up in games like Guild Wars 2 and Elder Scrolls Online that were taken directly from developers who were going through them at the time, or similar stories at the time. There are situations of childhood trauma. For example, the dialogue between Peter, Star-Lord, and his mother, a lot of the situations happened to Chris Rebert, one of the developers on the game, because he was scared to losing his mother at a very young age to depression. There were many situations, or many characters in Destiny and Destiny 2 who were dealing with anxiety and depression, and Dragon Age 2, who were dealing with anxiety and depression because the writers on those projects were dealing with the same. And as you probably heard today, if you were at the very wonderful keynote of Anne LeMay, the character Drac in Mass Effect, basically was her exploring a lot of feelings of maybe being too old for the industry or dealing with chronic pain and being irrelevant, which obviously is all untrue. Anne, Anne's over here. She came to my talk. Of course, it's also just a source of content. It's not always something to explore your feelings or your identity. Sometimes you just need an idea. You need to fill a page or come up with a name. So that's the first example, is names. A lot of people just put the names of their family and loved ones and their friends as the name of the characters in their games. Some people put the likenesses, like they need to model a character, so why not? I'm gonna put my mother or my son in this game. And some stories as well. So Patrick Redding, when he was a narrative designer on Far Cry 2, he's now a creative director at Warner Brothers, where I work. During his travels, he met a lot of people from a lot of different countries, and he sourced their backstories and put them on to the mercenaries in Far Cry 2 to give them a little bit more life and to help them, to share these stories that from the people he's encountered in his travels. There are environments. A lot of people basically they source where they're living now or where they grew up and create different environments from that in their games. Dialogues as well. Like some people say, how did you come up with that? Well, that's a conversation I had with my wife last night, and it just felt real and raw, and I wanted to use it, with permission, of course. When working on Modern Combat, we actually took photos of the dev team while we were working, and we put them on the security cameras. So, I mean, you'd have to squint to really make out what it was, but we knew we were in our own game, and that was special for us. Numbers, like a lot of times developers just have to come up with numbers. So a lot of the numbers that we see in the most popular games that we play are birthdays and anniversaries of loved ones or other, milestones. And gameplay. So my friend John Diaz, at the time when he was working on GTA 5, the private car odd jobs were a series of missions that you would do. They were actually sourced from his father, who was a career driver for his entire life. It was a lot of the stories that he used to bring home. So it was convenient. This is probably my favorite example of the entire talk. So Richard Flanagan, when working on Fract, a rhythm game, sourced, I'm going to read it because I'm going to butcher it otherwise. The heartbeat of our first daughter in utero from an early sonogram is pounding away in the beginning of Fract. It is the source of all the energy in the world. And if that doesn't give you shivers, nothing will. So Rihanna Pratchett, the daughter of the legendary Terry Pratchett in Rise of the Tomb Raider, she said that her father mentioned a memory that he didn't want to forget, which was her birth. And this actually found its way into one of the letters that Richard Croft wrote to young Lara in the game. A lot of people put gravestones or other such resting places so that they have another place to visit their family members after they've passed in their own games. My friend Juan, he was talking about in The Walking Dead Season 3, there was a memorial wall, and they needed pictures of people who died to the zombie apocalypse. And he asked if he could include a picture from one of his friends who passed away in 2009, and then other developers wanted to do the same. So if you actually play the game and look at the memorial wall, that's a lot of love. There are, of course, pets. Lots of pets that we see in games. Actually, even in the Minecraft story mode from Telltale is Juan's dog. Oh, is it Rocco? Became Blocko? But it's not uncommon. I mean, you see this in a lot of different games where our pets will make it in. So, of course, since I am asking you to do this, obviously, if you haven't caught on, I think this is a good thing. If you're not already doing it, I think we should put something personal in our games. There are risks that come associated with it that I have to mention. The first is content can be cut, especially if you're not working on a project alone, if you're working with other people, and especially if you have deadlines or other constraints. So if you put something meaningful in a game, be prepared for the real possibility that it's not going to make it to in the end product. And a lot of the examples that I mentioned, actually, not a lot, but a certain number where I tried to do this, I tried to do that, but it was cut. And that could be hurtful. But what's more hurtful is if it's modified. You put something personal to you, and then a director or someone who outranks you decides for the service of the game that this needs to be changed in one way or the other, not maliciously, but just through the process of creating games, and then that thing is not meaningful to you anymore, and you had your heart set in having this in your game. So be prepared for that as well. If you're not willing to entertain the possibility of this happening, maybe don't do it. And last but not least, use your best judgment. Of course, if you're going to do anything like this, if possible, ask for permission, make sure it's legal, and so in some cases, it's just not a good idea at all. So, yeah. So I'm going to take a little bit of a pivot, but bear with me because I'm going to link it all back together. But I wanted to talk to you about my journey making games with my children. So these are my children. I love them very much. I started making games with them when my son was 5, my eldest daughter was 3, and the youngest was still a newborn. So this is from a few years ago, but when we started, everyone was much younger than that. I knew even before I had children that I wanted to share my craft with them. I just didn't know how, because as I'm sure you all know, making games is hard, right? So how are we going to do that with kids who, might not have the same skills that we do? But I always loved to play games with them. And after a while, the games that are made for kids start to be less interesting for people who are older, and even older kids. Once they learn, for the example of these games, once they learn everything they can learn from these, which are taking turns, you can lose, don't cry when you lose, like basic things like that, then there's nothing interesting about rolling a die and moving a few spaces. There are no interesting decisions in this. So it became very hard to find games that could be entertaining for me and for my children in all their ages at the same time. So I wanted to try to tackle these two things at the same time. We're going to make games together, and we're going to make them so that they're interesting for everybody. And the idea actually came from my mother-in-law. She invited my kids over to make cupcakes and pizza. And my kids came home with these lopsided monstrosities that they were so proud of. And I realized quickly that they didn't actually make cupcakes and pizza. They just threw ingredients on them. It was my mother-in-law who went through the actual work of creating the food, right? But for my kids, they didn't say, look what I threw on this. They said, I made a cupcake, I made a pizza. So then I decided that's how I was going to approach this. I was going to design the game, and they were going to throw the ingredients on top of it. And they're still going to take ownership of it, at least as a first step, and then we'll see where it goes from there. So step 1 was we're going to make a card game. Not Magic the Gathering, we didn't make that. So what I did is I came up with the rules for the game. I designed it. What I wanted is a game that was simple enough for a 3-year-old to play and for a 5-year-old to find interesting. And I wanted the only thing that I would ask my kids to do is to go out and draw pictures. That's it. If I could accomplish this, then I would succeed, regardless of how good the game is. So this is the game that we came up with. I'll explain you the rules really quickly. It was, they called it Ali and Mimi's card game, because those are their names. I had called it before that Mind, Magic, and Meat. So we had 36 character cards, and each card had a different combination of stats that always added up to 7. And no 2 cards were alike, so it was impossible to have ties. There were rules cards as well that delineated rule order, how many cards you have in your hand, and which stat was more powerful and which stat was second to most powerful. I included the third there because when I didn't, my kids didn't understand what was happening, so I'm like, okay, what is the last? What is the worst? And the turns were simple. You have to choose a card in your hand, you play it down, you look at who has the highest stat, or who has the second highest in the case of a tie. That player wins and chooses which rule on top to change. So for my daughter, who was 3 years old, all she had to remember is, when it's your turn, choose a card. That's it. She played that card, and then I say, point to a pile that you want to change the rules, and she could point at a pile, and we moved on to the next turn. For her, that was enough. It was complicated enough as it is, and she even won sometimes, because that's how these games work. And for my son, initially, he actually went through, as a 5-year-old, he went through a process where initially, he would just play whatever had the highest stat. And later on, he realized that if someone played before him and he wasn't going to win, maybe he should hold on to that. And that was learning. That was growth. So it succeeded. The game was great. What I didn't expect is I was going to learn a lot about my kids through this. So after the first 12 or so characters, they really wanted to hurry up and finish the game. And I already had everything done. They would bring me the card. I would scan it and print out a small version and put it in the sleeve, and we were ready to go. But they didn't want to come up with characters. They just wanted me to tell them what to draw so we could hurry up the process. So I said, oh, you know what? That's fine. You drew your own 12 characters. Let's jump in. So I said, how about you draw me a goblin? And my son drew the green goblin. And I realized that that's actually the only goblin he knew as a 5-year-old. I'm like, okay, that's fine. And when I said ogre to my daughter, she only knew Shrek. Where really disappointed me is that neither of my kids knew what a Cthulhu was. But this was an opportunity to learn. And after a few of these, I said, you know what? No, I don't care how long it takes. Go out there, be creative, make up your own creatures. So my son came up with a pizza monster, and my daughter made a giraffe pillar. It was great. So we had 36 cards. We played the game in sleeves. We played it like right away. They helped me cut them up lopsided sometimes, but it was all fun. I surprised them by actually getting these cards printed, and they showed up about a week later, and all of a sudden, they went from, we made a game, to we made a real game. And they play with their cousins, and it was a blast. So basically, I succeeded. We started them off with content creation. We made a game. They loved it. We could play it together. We did play it a lot. We actually went on stage to present this at a local show in Montreal. They loved the process. It's on YouTube. I could share the video later if anyone's interested. So I was actually really happy with how it turned out, and I wanted to repeat the process. So I said, hey, you know what we're going to do? We're going to do it again, but this time we're going to make a board game. So I didn't think this one through. I didn't follow my own rule. I didn't design the board game and ask them to create content. I said, let's make a board game, and what do you want to make the board game about? My daughter said she wanted princesses, and my son said he wanted police. And then before I could say anything, they went off and started drawing princess polices. Which is great, but I didn't have an idea for a board game that incorporated this. And here they were coming picture after picture of princesses, and I was like overwhelmed, and I didn't know what to do about it. So I asked them, so I tried to come up with something, but of course it didn't really work out. And at the end, they lost interest, and while I was still trying to figure out the rules, and I realized, I learned two lessons. One was a right one, and the other, whoops, I skipped ahead. The other was maybe the wrong one. So the right one was be prepared, and the wrong one was maybe some themes can't be merged. And that's not a good lesson. I later realized that, every theme can be merged. You just have to be prepared. So I decided that we're going to make 2 board games. So this time I said, look, I know what the rules are. I explained the rules, and I said, you could add a theme to this. The rules were, it's like snakes and ladders, but when you fall in certain cases, you get cards, and then you could play the card. You could either draw a card or play a card, and that's it. Otherwise, it's like snakes and ladders. So my son made City Game I Love This, because those are all words he knows how to spell. So it's a city. When you land on certain stores, you get to take a card and buy a thing or use a thing. It's that simple. My daughter made 05Q765432110 plus because she's 3 years old. And she was really proud of her same city game where you land on stores and you could buy things. And I realized that what I did was a little bit unfair because my son came up with the idea. He was a little bit older, and my daughter was just excited about being part of it. So of course she was going to copy what he was doing, and maybe I could do this better. So the lesson was maybe encourage originality. That wasn't a fail. It was actually a success. They were both proud of their games, but maybe we could do this better. So instead, I said, what we're going to do is make 2 different board games, right? So how are you going to prepare for this? This is a little bit more complicated. So I had another plan in mind. Right before putting them to bed, I said, tomorrow we're going to make board games. What would you like to make board games about? So then they're going to go to bed after. So I don't really care about them losing interest or anything because I could reintroduce the subject once I have the rules ready the next day. So my daughter said she wanted to make a restaurant game, and my son said he wanted to make a firefighter game. Great. Off to bed they went. I came up with very simple rules. In the restaurant, you had patrons show up, and you had to give them like cards, based on your cards, food as close as possible to what they wanted, and then you score points based on that, and you either win or lose. For my son, there was a city, and there were different tiles that represented houses, and once in a while you drew a card, and it tells you which house caught fire, and every turn the die would go up. If it reaches 6, the house burned down, and you could move and decide. You could even put out more than 1 fire at a time, but it was a co-op game where you're trying to put out X fires before Y houses burn down to win. So both games worked mechanically, except my daughter really resisted having a fail condition in her restaurant game. She didn't want to lose. She wanted to give everyone all the food. She wanted to pick up all the cards and just match it. So I said, fine, this is your game. We're going to do it your way. The problem was my son's game was fun, and my daughter wanted to play that game. But my son didn't want to play once we changed the rules. He's like, no, this is like a tea party. There's nothing wrong with tea parties. I love tea parties, but my daughter felt like something was missing because every time we came to sit down to play, it was just me and her, and my son was not interested. He wanted to score points and win, right? He didn't want to just match cards. So unfortunately for this situation, it was a little bit different. Had that not been part of the equation, I would have considered it a success. But because she was sad about the outcome, I said, okay, next time knowing this, I'm going to enforce the rules. I'm going to say, no, no, no. You come up with a theme, the rules stay the same, and we'll figure it out later when you're older and understand the consequences. So then we decided to try step number 2 again. So remember when I said maybe 2 different conflicting themes can't be merged? I'm like, no, you know what, that's not going to work. What I'm going to do is apply the same thing I learned in the process. We're going to come up with the rules first, then I'm going to source the themes, and we'll make it work based on the constraints. So I had this board game idea where I just wanted one creature, one entity to want to make it to the end, and that represented all of the human players, and another entity represented the AI, or the non-player characters, and it was a race to the finish. So I said, one of you pick who we play, and one of you pick who is trying to beat us in the race. So my son said, oh, we're trying to beat the robots. I'm like, okay, no problem. And my daughter said, and we are pets. So the story we came up with is that the robots were trying to kill the humans, my son's idea, and the pets were trying to warn them beforehand. It actually worked out, right? And the tiles that you see, there are blue tiles and red tiles, so we copied our old snakes and ladders idea. If you found a blue tile, you could either play a blue card if you have one, or draw a blue card. And the same thing for the pink tiles that had more powerful versions of those cards. So we started working on the cards. Of course, the rule is my daughter can't read, so even if the cards have text, you don't need them to play them. The first card was called Man's Best Friend. So you could take any of the pets, and if anyone wins, the whole team wins. So taught my kids that, hey, cooperate, play together. You could take any of the pets and move them to the nearest pink tile. And there's Robot Haircut, where you could take any of the robots and move them back to the nearest blue tile. This one gave me a little bit of a heart attack. It's called Robo Rocket, and that is just a rocket and nothing else. Where you could take one of the robots and send it to the start. Yeah. The game was a success. We loved it. We played it a lot of times. We had a lot of fun. And that one, I already created the board beforehand, so we were able to just print it out and play really quickly. And I learned my lesson. So it wasn't the problem wasn't that police and princesses can't fit together or that certain themes can't fit together. The problem is I didn't give it time. So if I actually either start off with the rules beforehand or set it up differently, I could actually accomplish this and make both my kids happy with any 2 themes. Now was the time to make video games. I'm giving you, by the way, between all of these board games, there were many other board games that I'm not mentioning because we were refining the process. So I'm just talking about the big milestones, right? So after several years, we decided, okay, it was not several, maybe a year or 2. We decided we were going to work on our first video game together. So what I wanted is to keep it as simple as possible. I was going to have 2 characters on screen that are protagonists, one that my daughter gets to choose and one that my son gets to choose. They get to choose what the theme is and what the verb is, what the character is able to do. And then we're going to have antagonists on the screen. And whatever the verbs are, that is what the protagonists are trying to do. That's it. Keep it as simple as that and leave the rest up to my kids. I would do the coding. At this point, we had so many successes that they were more patient. They understood when I told them this game is going to take longer, we're going to do it in steps. I wasn't going to lose them. I wasn't worried about that. We worked on some board games that took more time. So my son has something for robots. He's like, okay, my character is a robot. All right, and what do you want to do? What's your verb? He's like, I'm shooting lasers from my eyes. I'm like, okay, and it's going to evaporate the bad guys. I'm like, all right, fine. And then I asked my daughter, what do you want to be? She's like, I want to be a little girl. I'm like, okay, and what's your verb? She's like, I want to throw flowers at the bad guys. I'm like, okay, and what does that do? It puts them to sleep. Perfect. Okay, this works. I was a little worried when I heard flowers, but I'm like, okay, I could work with this. So then the game took an unexpected turn. First, I asked them what they wanted the antagonist to be, and my son said robots again. I'm like, okay, fine. And my daughter said a dragon, which surprised me, but was really cool. I'm like, okay, we're going to run with this. So I put them in the game, and what happened completely surprised me. It took me by surprise. It was the same mechanics that they chose. My daughter would rush to put the antagonist to sleep before my son could kill them. And that's how she saw that she was winning. Yay! sorry. Yay, this one fell asleep. You're not able to get him. My son's like, ah. But of course, he's older and he's like more able with a controller, so I actually had to tweak the values to give her more speed and to make it seem a little more fair. I made him jump higher, and we like tweaked it. And then we had the display of the score on top that showed how many were vaporized and how many were put to sleep, and it became a competitive, asymmetrical game that I did not see coming. It was a success. My kids loved it. We made several similar games like this that took different turns, but this is the first one, and the one I'm most proud of because I didn't see this coming. It's not to be mistaken with this game that took our title and, yeah, complete ripoff. Yeah, don't. I mean, this is from my friend Salim, by the way. It's a wonderful game. You should play it. I was just kidding. So the lesson I learned here is let's just have fun. Let's just try it. It didn't matter how many times I failed. It didn't matter how many false starts we had. I was always able to pick up the football and try again. Kids have short memories, and you're able to get started again. So it worked out. And what surprised me a little bit was that it didn't take much for my kids to start making their own games. We showed them Scratch. My son makes robot games because that's what he loves. My daughter made a game about a cat that collects apples. She made it on her own. I had nothing to do. After showing her the tool, I didn't have anything to do with it. Her game did not have a fail condition. She's perfectly happy with it. It's totally legit. And then another surprise. My son came home and he said, "Dad, I made a movie. Do you want to see my movie?" I'm like, "You made a what? Show me your movie." So I'm warning you, if you get nauseous, this might actually have an effect on you because it's a little shaky, but bear with it. We got him a tripod eventually. That's my favorite part. Just like to kick the tree. So, I'm sorry, a little emotional about this. I actually cried the first time he showed it to me as well. And I told him, "How did you learn how to do this? I mean, making movies is hard." He's like, "Yeah, but I make games. That's harder." And that gave him a lot of confidence to just go out and try things because I kept telling him, making games are hard. You know, it's going to be difficult. We might fail, but it's okay. And that gave him a lot of confidence. And now, like, my daughter, eventually, he taught her how to do it, and they have a tripod, and they make better movies now. But this is still my favorite, all right? It took me by complete surprise in more than one way. So I learned a lot in my career in the last 12 years that I've been in the industry, and even before that, of course. As a human being, I learned that I didn't like the way that my people were represented in games. And by my people, I mean a lot of different things. And I wanted to do something about it. As a game dev, I learned that putting ourselves in our games is actually very difficult, but it's worthwhile. You could learn a lot from it, and you could benefit a lot from it. As a person of this community, I learned that even when other people use games as a way to explore their own identities, even if I can't directly relate with that, I can indirectly relate with that, and that helps me as well, so I should encourage that. And as a father, I learned to bring my full self home. So whoever I am at work is the same person I am at home. The two are not distinct. I'm still figuring this out, still part of the journey, and I'm still making mistakes along the way as we all are, and that's totally okay. I'm okay with that. So I'm bringing you this as part of, as an in-between in the journey, not as an ending result. I don't know how this is gonna evolve, and I make no promises, except that I'm gonna keep going. But what I do know is that we can put ourselves in our games to make them more meaningful. And there's nothing like making meaningful games. So we all here because we have a passion for making games, and this passion could be lost. But if we stick to putting ourselves in our games and making them meaningful for us, then we actually can share this with others. And that's it. Thank you very much. So I have 10 minutes for questions. I'm not sure what kind of questions you'd ask, but you're welcome to ask whatever you'd like. What's the name of the movie? It was A Peaceful Picnic. There's a microphone in the back if anyone else has any questions. There's one over there.
Are there any depictions of Islam that you have seen that felt accurate to you in video games?
Actually, there were quite a bit in recent times. There was a really good character in Tacoma called, what's her name? Asmadi is her last name. I can't remember her first name. But she was a scientist and she was brilliant. And yes, she was Muslim, but Islam was just part of her identity. So she wasn't tokenized in any which way. And I felt it was genuine and real. I mean, without knowing for sure, it felt like they consulted for her character. I could really tell. So it was either a Muslim who worked on the team who put that character there, or they did their homework and they actually asked the right questions. There were other characters, of course. Of course, you're going to ask me in front of people and I'm going to forget them all. I gave a GDC talk where I listed at least 10 examples, so maybe I'll point to that. And if you reach me later, I'll give you more. Sorry, it's pressure of being in front of people. I can't think. Anyone else? You don't have to ask a question. It's okay. All right? We can call it? Okay. Thank you very much.